Welcome to Crimson Threads, the channel that unravels the dark seams of human nature. We often believe that monsters lurk in the shadows, strangers in the night. But sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones we invite into our homes, share our meals with, and call family. The story you are about to hear is one such case, a tale of secrets, betrayal, and a single violent act that shattered the pristine facade of a wealthy family, revealing the rotten core within. It's a shocking reminder that behind closed doors, even the most perfect lives can be a gilded cage. Before we draw back the curtain on this tragedy, if you appreciate deep dives into the psychology of crime, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep telling these important, cautionary tales. Now settle in as we travel to the manicured lawns and whispered scandals of the Beaumont estate. The Beaumont estate was less a house and more a declaration. Carved from pale limestone and set upon 10 acres of aggressively perfect gardens, it stood as a monument to old money and unshakable influence. From the outside, it was a fortress of tranquility and taste. But for Clara Beaumont, its walls had become the beautifully decorated bars of a cage, and its matriarch, Eleanor Beaumont, was the ever-watchful warden. Clara had married into this world 8 years ago. She, a bright-eyed art history graduate from a middle-class background, had been swept away by Richard Beaumont, a man who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. In the beginning, it was a fairy tale. Richard was charming, attentive, and his world was one of casual luxury she'd only read about. His mother, Eleanor, had been cautiously welcoming, her smiles as precisely arranged as the roses in her garden. But the fairy tale, like all tales, had a darker side. Richard's attentiveness soon revealed itself as a form of control, a reflection of his mother's own suffocating brand of love. He wasn't cruel, not in a way that left bruises. His cruelty was one of quiet dismissal, of prioritizing his mother's opinions over his wife's, of treating Clara as another beautiful acquisition, like the Monet in the hallway or the vintage sports car in the garage. She was there to look lovely, to host flawless dinner parties, and, most importantly, to produce an heir. She had succeeded in that last task, giving them Leo, a bright, beautiful boy who was now 6 years old. Yet, even her son felt like a shared commodity, another asset of the Beaumont line, shaped more by his grandmother's iron will than his mother's gentle hand. Eleanor's initial welcome had slowly curdled into a relentless campaign of passive-aggressive warfare. Every aspect of Clara's life was subject to her mother-in-law's silent, yet damning scrutiny. There were the little comments, dropped like poison into the conversation. "That's an interesting choice of dress, dear. So bold." Or, "I do hope you're making sure Leo spends more time on his Latin primers than on those messy finger paints. He's a Beaumont, after all." The staff reported to Eleanor. The chef knew Eleanor's preferred menu. The housekeeper organized the home to Eleanor's exacting standards. Clara was the lady of the house in title only. In reality, she was a guest, one whose visa was always on the verge of being revoked. Her loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the vast, echoing rooms of the estate. Richard was often away on business, and when he was home, he was emotionally distant, a polite stranger who shared her bed. It was in this desert of affection that she found an oasis. His name was Liam. Liam was the head landscaper, a man whose hands were calloused from real work, whose skin was tanned by the sun, not a lamp at a country club. He was quiet, with kind eyes that saw her, not the Beaumont name she carried. It started innocently, a shared smile as he pruned the roses near the conservatory, a brief conversation about a struggling dogwood tree. His voice was warm, his gaze direct and free of the judgment she felt from everyone else in her life. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. She learned he was a widower, raising a teenage daughter on his own. He spoke of his struggles and his simple joys with an honesty that was intoxicating. For the first time in years, Clara felt seen. She began to find excuses to walk the grounds, her path always conveniently intersecting with his. They would talk for hours, hidden by the high hedges of the formal garden. The affair began one rainy afternoon in the old greenhouse at the far end of the property. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. The rain drumming on the glass panes created a world just for them. He hadn't kissed her with the brash entitlement of a man like Richard. He had touched her cheek, his thumb gently tracing her jawline, and his eyes had asked a question. Her answer was a desperate, soul-crushing sob as she fell into his arms. Their connection was not just physical. It was an emotional lifeline. With Liam, she was just Clara. He didn't care about which fork was used for the fish course or the latest gossip from the charity gala. He cared about the book she was reading, the sadness in her eyes, the dreams she had long since buried. He made her feel real, vibrant, and alive. For a few stolen hours a week, she wasn't a Beaumont. She was free. The secret was a dangerous, exhilarating weight. She bought a burner phone, and they communicated through coded texts. Their meetings were meticulously planned, always in the forgotten corners of the sprawling estate where no one ever went. For a year they were careful. For a year they were safe. The end of that safety came on a Tuesday in late September. It was Eleanor's birthday, and the house was buzzing with preparations for a grand dinner party. Clara had snuck away to meet Liam in the small, private library on the second floor, a room Eleanor hadn't entered in years, preferring the grander study downstairs. They had shared a hurried, whispered conversation, a stolen kiss. As he left, Liam had squeezed her hand, leaving a small, carved wooden bird in her palm, a gift for her own birthday, which had been the week prior. It was a simple, beautiful thing, full of more meaning than the diamond bracelet Richard had given her. Distracted by the impending party, Clara had slipped the bird into the pocket of her blazer and forgotten about it. Later that afternoon, she was in the drawing room with Eleanor, finalizing the seating chart. Her mother-in-law was in a particularly imperious mood, critiquing every choice, her voice a low, condescending murmur. "Really, Clara?" Eleanor had said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the chart. "Placing the Hendersons next to the Wallaces? After their public spat at the regatta? It's social suicide. Sometimes I wonder if you pay any attention at all." Clara, flustered, had stood up to retrieve her notes from the side table. As she leaned over, the small wooden bird slipped from her pocket and landed on the plush Aubusson rug with a soft thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and predatory, darted from the bird to Clara's face. Clara's heart stopped. She saw a flicker of something in Eleanor's gaze, not just suspicion, but a cold, calculating certainty. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously soft. "It's nothing," Clara stammered, reaching for it. "Just a trinket." But Eleanor was faster. She bent with a surprising agility and plucked it from the floor. She examined the carving, her thumb tracing its smooth lines. It was clearly handmade, rustic, and bore no maker's mark from a high-end boutique. It was not a Beaumont-approved object. "Where did you get this?" Eleanor's voice was like ice. "A friend gave it to me," Clara said, her own voice a traitorous squeak. "A friend." Eleanor's lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You have so few of those, dear, and none that would gift you something so common." That night, after the last of the birthday guests had departed, Eleanor summoned Clara to the main study. Richard was already there, standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Richard, dear, why don't you wait for us in the drawing room?" Eleanor said, a clear dismissal. He left without a word, a silent accomplice to his mother's impending judgment. The study was Eleanor's throne room. Dark mahogany, leather-bound books that were never read, and a single, imposing desk behind which she now sat. She placed the small wooden bird in the center of the desk, like a piece of evidence at a trial. "I had a conversation with our head of security this evening," Eleanor began, her voice calm and measured. "I had him review the footage from the security cameras on the grounds. It seems our landscaper has been spending a great deal of time in areas where there is no landscaping to be done. The old greenhouse, the boathouse, the second-floor library. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The room tilted. "He's a widower, isn't he?" Eleanor continued, her eyes boring into Clara's. "Raising a daughter. How touching. And how utterly predictable." Clara couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with terror. "You have brought filth into my home," Eleanor hissed, the civility finally cracking. "You have disrespected my son. You have shamed this family. You are a common, worthless tramp, and I should have known better than to let Richard marry so far beneath him." The words were like slaps, each one stinging more than the last. "Here is what is going to happen," Eleanor said, leaning forward. "You will end this disgusting little affair immediately. You will never speak to that man again. He will be fired in the morning, without severance, and with a signed non-disclosure agreement so tight he won't be able to mention the name Beaumont without facing financial ruin. You, in turn, will rededicate yourself to your husband and your son. You will be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and you will do it with a smile on your face every single day. Or I will destroy you." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "I will show Richard the security footage," Eleanor elaborated, enjoying Clara's terror. "I will call my lawyers. I will ensure that when he divorces you, you will leave this house with nothing. Not a penny of the Beaumont fortune. And you will not get custody of Leo. I will personally testify that you are an unfit mother, a morally bankrupt adulteress. You will be lucky to see your son on supervised visits once a month. Do you understand me?" Clara could only nod, tears streaming down her face. It was a checkmate. Eleanor had taken everything from her dignity, her one source of happiness, and now her future. The next 2 days were a living hell. Liam was fired, just as Eleanor had promised. He was escorted off the property by security, and his final paycheck was delivered by a courier with the NDA attached. He tried to call Clara's burner phone, but she was too terrified to answer. She smashed it with a heavy book, shattering her only link to him. Eleanor watched her every move. Her presence was a constant, oppressive weight. She would appear silently in doorways, her eyes cold and triumphant. She made Clara call the caterers for an upcoming charity luncheon, her voice a saccharine mockery as she supervised the call. "Make sure you sound cheerful, dear. A happy home is a reflection on the family." The breaking point came on Thursday evening. Clara was in the kitchen, numbly staring at a recipe for coco vin, when Eleanor entered. She was holding her phone. "I just had the most productive call with my attorney," she said, her tone light and conversational. "We were discussing some updates to my will and to the family trust. It's amazing what can be done to protect one's assets from unfortunate influences." She smiled, a flash of white teeth. "I've also scheduled a meeting with Richard for tomorrow morning. I think it's time he and I had a serious talk about the future of his family and the importance of loyalty." The implication was clear. Eleanor wasn't going to let it go. She was going to hold this over Clara's head forever. Or worse, she was going to tell Richard anyway, just to watch the world burn. She would poison Richard against her, and then, when Clara was at her most vulnerable, she would cast her out and take Leo. Something inside Clara snapped. The years of quiet humiliations, the loneliness, the suffocating control, the loss of Liam, and now the threat of losing her sonnet all coalesced into a single, blinding point of white-hot rage. She looked at the woman before her, this perfectly coiffed monster who had systematically dismantled her life, and she felt nothing but a profound, terrifying hatred. The argument started there, in the gleaming, sterile kitchen. Clara finally found her voice, a voice raw with pain and fury. She accused Eleanor of being a cruel, manipulative tyrant. Eleanor laughed it off, her words dripping with scorn. "You have no one to blame but yourself, you little fool. Did you really think you could play games in my house and not get caught?" The argument moved from the kitchen, down the hall, and into the conservatory, a vast glass room filled with Eleanor's prized orchids. The air was warm and humid. The argument escalated, their voices rising, echoing off the glass panes. "I will not let you take my son," Clara screamed, her body trembling. "He is not your son," Eleanor retorted. her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. He is a Beaumont, and you are just the vessel that carried him. A vessel that can be easily replaced. That was it. That was the line. In that moment, Eleanor ceased to be a person to Clara. She was an obstacle, a disease that had to be cut out. Clara's eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy, marble pedestal near the entrance. Atop it sat a small, bronze sculpture of a hummingbird that a visiting artist had gifted Eleanor years ago. It was solid, hefty. Without thinking, without planning, she acted. A primal scream of pure, unadulterated anguish tore from her throat as she lunged for the statue. She wrenched it from its base, the weight of it surprising her. Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally registering on her face. But it was too late. Clara swung the bronze bird with all the force of her pent-up rage and despair. The sound of the impact was sickening, a wet, cracking thud that seemed to vibrate through the very glass of the conservatory. Eleanor stumbled back, a look of stunned disbelief on her face. A dark red line appeared on her temple. She raised a hand to the wound, her fingers coming away slick with blood. She opened her mouth to speak, or perhaps to scream, but Clara swung again, and again, and again, long after Eleanor had crumpled to the cold, tiled floor amidst the fallen orchid petals. Silence. The only sound was Clara's own ragged breathing, her gasps tearing through the humid air. She stood over the body, the bronze bird heavy in her hand, dripping. The rage drained away as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, sharp, and utterly terrifying clarity. She looked down at her mother-in-law, at the still, broken form lying on the floor. She looked at the blood spattered on the white orchids. She looked at the weapon in her hand. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She had to think. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she couldn't be caught. Leo. She had to protect Leo. Her mind, which had been a storm of emotion moments before, became a machine of pure, calculated logic. She dropped the statue into a large potting bag filled with soil. She would dispose of it later. She looked at the scene. It needed to look like a robbery, a struggle. She overturned a large potted palm, spilling dirt across the tiles. She smashed a glass-topped table. She ran back to the study and opened the French doors that led to the patio, forcing the lock to make it look like a break-in. She grabbed a handful of small, valuable-looking trinkets from the desk and shoved them into her pocket to discard later. She needed an alibi. She raced upstairs to her bathroom, stripping off her clothes, her hands shaking so violently she could barely work the buttons. She saw blood on her sleeve. She shoved the clothes into a laundry bag, deep beneath other items. She would wash them with bleach. She scrubbed her hands and arms under scalding water until they were red and raw. Then she did the hardest part. She went to her bedroom, sat on the edge of her bed, took a deep, shuddering breath, and picked up the phone. She dialed Richard's number. When he answered, she let out a piercing, hysterical scream, a performance so convincing it terrified even herself. "Richard!" she cried, forcing a torrent of fake sobs. "Something's happened. I was upstairs. I heard a crash. I think someone's in the house. I'm so scared. I think it's your mother." The gilded cage had been broken open, but freedom had come at an unimaginable price. And as she listened to her husband's frantic voice on the other end of the line, Clara Beaumont knew her real ordeal had only just begun. Detective Isabella Rossi stepped under the yellow police tape, her eyes scanning the Beaumont estate with a practiced, weary gaze. In her 15 years with the Homicide Division, she'd seen it all, but the sheer scale of wealth always added a unique flavor to a crime scene. Money didn't prevent murder. It just provided better upholstery to bleed on. The grounds were crawling with uniformed officers, forensic vans were parked neatly on the gravel driveway, and a small army of reporters was already camped out by the main gates, their long-lens cameras like vultures waiting for a meal. Rossi was a sharp, observant woman in her late 40s, with a reputation for being methodical and unflappable. She had a knack for seeing the hairline cracks in a perfect facade, and the Beaumont family's facade looked like it had been custom-built by Hollywood. Her partner, Detective Ben Carter, a younger, more impressionable detective, met her at the entrance to the conservatory. "It's a nasty one, Izzy," he said, gesturing inside. "Victim is Eleanor Beaumont, 68. Looks like blunt force trauma to the head. Multiple impacts." Rossi stepped into the humid air of the conservatory. The sweet scent of orchids now mingled with the metallic tang of blood. The scene was chaotic. An overturned table, shattered glass, soil and plant fronds strewn across the floor. In the center of it all lay the victim, a small, elegantly dressed woman whose final expression was one of surprised indignation. The forensic team was already at work, their movements precise and quiet. "Husband and daughter-in-law are in the main house," Carter continued. "The daughter-in-law, Clara, is the one who found her. Says she was upstairs, heard a crash, got scared, and called the husband, Richard, who then called 911. He got here just before the first patrol car." "She didn't call 911 herself?" Rossi asked, her eyes not leaving the body. "Says she was too panicked, just called her husband," Carter replied. "She's pretty shaken up. Or she's putting on a good show." "They always are," Rossi murmured. She walked the perimeter of the room, her gaze taking in every detail. "The forced entry on the French doors looks convenient," she observed, pointing to the splintered wood around the lock. "Pry marks are a little too clean, too obvious. And the thief was considerate enough to close the door behind him." "You thinking it's staged?" "I'm thinking a real burglar who gets surprised by the homeowner either bolts immediately or makes a whole lot more mess on their way out. This feels tidy." "What was taken?" "That's the other thing," Carter said, flipping through his notepad. "According to the Sun, nothing of significant value is missing. Some paintings on the walls worth more than my house are untouched. But a few silver picture frames and some small porcelain figures from the study are gone. The daughter-in-law says the victim's jewelry box in her bedroom is untouched. So, we have a burglar who breaks into a mansion, ignores the multi-million-dollar art, kills the owner, and makes off with a few $100s worth of trinkets?" Rossi raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't track." She spent another 20 minutes at the scene, observing the blood spatter patterns, the position of the body, and the scattered debris, before heading into the main house to interview the family. The drawing room was a cavern of opulent silence. Richard Beaumont stood by a massive, unlit fireplace, his back to the room. He was a tall, handsome man, immaculately dressed even in his grief. Clara Beaumont was curled up on a silk sofa, a cashmere blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though the room was warm. A uniformed officer stood discreetly in the corner. Rossi started with the husband. His grief felt genuine, but restrained. It was the grief of a man who had lost a matriarch, a CEO, not just a mother. He spoke of her in reverent terms, describing her as the unshakable foundation of their family. "Was your mother having any trouble with anyone?" Rossi asked, her tone gentle but firm. "Any business disputes? Disgruntled employees?" "My mother was a formidable woman," Richard said, his voice level. "She didn't suffer fools. But I can't imagine anyone hating her enough to do. This is barbaric." "The scene was staged to look like a robbery," Rossi stated, watching his reaction. There was a flicker of something in his eye. Surprise? Or something else? "A robbery? But what would they take?" he asked, genuinely perplexed. "Exactly," Rossi said. She then turned her attention to Clara. The daughter-in-law was a different story. Her grief was palpable, theatrical. Her body trembled, her eyes were red and swollen, and she clutched a tissue in her white-knuckled hand. She recounted her story, her voice choked with sobs. Hearing the crash from upstairs, the fear that paralyzed her, hiding in her closet until she heard the intruder leave, calling Richard in a panic. "Mrs. Beaumont," Rossi said, her voice softening, "did you and your mother-in-law get along?" A fresh wave of tears came. "Eleanor was. She was a strong woman," Clara wept. "She had high standards, but she was a wonderful grandmother to my son. She was the heart of this family. I loved her." Rossi had heard the phrase strong woman used to describe difficult victims before. It was a polite euphemism. And the way Clara said, "I loved her," felt like a line she was trying to convince herself of. Rossi noticed faint, reddish marks on Clara's hands and forearms, almost like friction burns. "You have some marks on your arms, Mrs. Beaumont," Rossi observed casually. Clara looked down as if seeing them for the first time. "Oh," she said, her voice small. When I was scrubbing the floors earlier, the cleaning solution must have irritated my skin." A woman who lived in a fully staffed mansion was scrubbing her own floors? It was the first obvious lie, a small, clumsy tear in her carefully woven story. The investigation kicked into high gear over the next 48 hours. Rossi's team began digging, and the gilded facade of the Beaumont family started to flake away. The first major discovery came from the household staff. Rossi interviewed the housekeeper, a woman named Maria who had worked for the family for 20 years. After some gentle prodding, Maria's loyalty to her late employer gave way to a flood of information. She spoke of the constant tension between Eleanor and Clara. She described Eleanor's relentless criticism, the way she would undermine Clara in front of the staff and her own son. "Mrs. Eleanor, she was particular," Maria said, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Clara, she tried so hard, but it was never good enough." The house was not happy. The next crack appeared in the family's finances. A forensic accountant on Rossi's team uncovered that Richard Beaumont's import-export business was in serious trouble. He was leveraged to the hilt with several large loans on the verge of default. Interestingly, Eleanor Beaumont had recently refused to bail him out, according to a string of terse emails between them. However, a clause in her will stipulated that upon her death, a significant family trust would be used to clear all of her son's outstanding business debts. Richard now had a multi-million-dollar motive. But the real breakthrough came from the digital forensics unit. They had collected all the family's electronic devices. On Clara's laptop, buried in a deleted folder, they found a series of heartfelt, unsent letters addressed to someone named L. They were love letters, filled with passion, longing, and the desperation of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage. L was not hard to find. A quick check of the estate's employment records turned up one Liam O'Connell, the head landscaper, who had been abruptly fired 2 days before the murder. Rossi and Carter paid a visit to Liam at his modest home on the other side of town. He was a man drowning in fear and grief. He initially denied everything, terrified of the Beaumont's power even now. But when Rossi showed him a printout of one of Clara's letters, he broke down. He told them everything. The affair, the secret meetings, the genuine love he felt for Clara. He described her as a prisoner in her own home. Then he told them about Eleanor finding out. "She called me the morning she was fired," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, from a burner phone. She was terrified. She said her mother-in-law knew everything and had threatened to take her son away from her. She said Eleanor was going to ruin both of us. Then the phone went dead. I tried calling back, but it was disconnected. I didn't know what to do." Now all the pieces were clicking into place for Rossi. A desperate woman, a brutal threat, a crime of passion. The staged robbery was the clumsy work of a panicked amateur, not a professional thief. The trinkets taken were an afterthought, a futile attempt to create a narrative. Rossi brought Clara Beaumont back to the station. This time, the kid gloves were off. They sat in a sterile, gray interrogation room, a stark contrast to the luxurious trappings Clara was used to. "We need to talk about Liam O'Connell," Rossi began, placing a photo of the landscaper on the table between them. Clara's composure, already fragile, shattered completely. She denied it, but her denials were weak, breathless. "We know about the affair, Clara," Rossi said, her voice even. "We know your mother-in-law found out. We know she threatened you. She was going to take your son, wasn't she?" Clara stared at Rossi, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hatred. "We also found traces of bleach in your laundry room, in a load of laundry done late on the night of the murder," Rossi continued, bluffing slightly. "The lab results weren't back, but the housekeeper had mentioned Clara insisting on doing a special load herself. What were you washing so urgently, Clara? What were you trying to hide? Rossi leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. And those marks on your arms. They're not from cleaning solutions. The ME found traces of skin under your mother-in-law's fingernails. She fought back, didn't she? Scratched you as you were. Struggling. Clara began to rock back and forth, her hands clasped over her mouth, a low keening sound escaping her lips. The perfect wife, the grieving daughter-in-law, was gone. In her place was a trapped, terrified woman on the verge of confessing. We haven't found the murder weapon yet, Rossi said, playing her final card. But we will. We're searching every inch of that estate. And when we find it, it will have your fingerprints on it. You can help yourself now. You can tell us what happened. Tell us why. Clara looked up, tears carving paths through her makeup. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to be closing in, just like the walls of the Beaumont estate had. She had traded one cage for another. She wasn't going to stop, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She was going to take my son. She called him a vessel. She called me a vessel. It wasn't a full confession, but it was the beginning of one. Rossi leaned back in her chair. She had her. The investigator's gaze had seen through the money, the lies, and the performance of grief, right to the ugly, desperate truth. As she motioned for Carter to come in, Rossi felt a familiar, grim satisfaction. But as she looked at the broken woman across the table, she also felt a pang of something else. This wasn't a case of a cold-blooded monster. This was the story of what happens when a gilded cage is shaken, and the pretty little bird inside finally decides to fight back. The only question left was, had she acted alone? Richard's convenient financial motive still lingered in the back of Rossi's mind. The case was getting clearer, but it was far from simple. The confession, when it finally came, did not arrive in a single cathartic flood. It came in fits and starts, a broken narrative pieced together between racking sobs and long, vacant silences in the sterile gray of the interrogation room. Detective Rossi let Clara dictate the pace, offering tissues and cups of water, creating a small island of calm in the storm of Clara's self-destruction. The performance was over, and all that remained was the raw, ugly truth. Clara recounted the final, venomous argument in the conservatory. She described Eleanor's words, the way they had stripped her of her identity, reducing her to a mere vessel. In her telling, the act itself was a blur, a red haze of rage where she lost control. I didn't even know what I was doing, she whispered, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. I couldn't hear those words anymore. I couldn't let her say them. I saw the statue and I just wanted her to stop. She confessed to the staging of the robbery, the pathetic attempt to create a story that even she knew was paper-thin. She told them where she had hidden the murder weapon, the bronze hummingbird statuette, the bottom of a large bag of orchid fertilizer in the potting shed. She admitted to washing her blood-spattered clothes and scrubbing her skin raw. It was a complete confession to the act of killing Eleanor Beaumont. But Rossi was a student of human nature, and she knew that confessions, like any story, could have multiple authors. Clara had confessed to the what and the how. Rossi was still troubled by the why, more specifically, why now? And she was deeply troubled by the convenient silence of the grieving son. Richard. Was your husband, Richard, aware of your affair with Liam? Rossi asked, her tone carefully neutral. Clara flinched, pulling back as if struck. No, of course not. He would have been devastated. He was also in significant financial trouble, wasn't he? Rossi pressed gently. We know your mother-in-law had refused to help him, and we know that her death solved all his debt problems. That's a powerful motive, Clara. Richard would never, she started, but her voice faltered. Doubt, a seed Rossi had planted, was beginning to sprout. Had his distance been simple neglect, or was it something more calculated? Think about it, Clara, Rossi said, leaning in. Eleanor was controlling. She controlled you, she controlled the staff, and she controlled her son. Do you really believe she wouldn't have used her knowledge of your affair as a weapon against him, too? To control him, to force him to fall in line? A new, horrifying possibility began to dawn on Clara's face. She replayed the last few days in her mind. Richard's odd detachment after the birthday party. His silent departure from the study, leaving her to face Eleanor's wrath alone. His complete lack of questioning her flimsy story on the night of the murder. He had simply accepted it. His grief focused more on the disruption to his world than the loss of his mother. While Clara was being formally processed and charged, Rossi sent Carter with a warrant to the Beaumont estate. They retrieved the bronze statue from the fertilizer bag, its intricate wings caked with dried blood and soil. But Carter also had instructions to look for something else. Rossi wanted a deep dive into Richard's personal effects, specifically his communications with his mother. In Richard's home office, tucked away in a desk drawer, Carter found a second cell phone, not a burner, but a private line. His text history told a chilling story. The conversations between Richard and Eleanor over the last few weeks were cold and transactional. He begged for money. She refused, berating him for his poor business decisions. Then, there was a message from Richard to his mother, sent the afternoon before the murder. It read, "I know you're meeting with Clara tonight. She's more unstable than you think. Be careful what you push her to do. People like her can be unpredictable when they're cornered." It was the smoking gun Rossi had been looking for. It wasn't proof of conspiracy to commit murder, but it was proof of something almost as sinister, malicious foresight. Richard had known his wife was a powder keg, and he had known his mother was holding a match. He hadn't just stood back and let it happen. He had practically given his mother a nudge towards the flame, knowing full well there was a chance of an explosion. And he knew that either way the conflict resolved, his problems would be over. If Clara left, he was free of a wife he no longer loved. If something happened to his mother, his debts would be cleared. He had set a collision course and positioned himself to profit from the wreckage. Rossi brought Richard in. He arrived with a high-priced lawyer, his demeanor one of offended dignity. He was no longer the grieving son, but the wronged husband, his face a mask of cold fury. "You're accusing me of being involved in my own mother's murder? This is insane," he scoffed. Rossi didn't respond. She simply slid the transcript of the text message across the table. "Unstable people are unpredictable, Richard. Is that why you didn't question your wife's story? Were you just waiting to see how your little experiment turned out?" The color drained from his face. His lawyer immediately advised him not to say another word. There wasn't enough to charge Richard with murder, but Rossi had enough to leak the story to the press, the story of a cold, calculating husband who knew his wife was on the edge and did nothing, all while standing to gain millions. The court of public opinion would be his jury. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The story of the Beaumont betrayal became a media sensation. Clara, the killer in Kashmir, was painted as a tragic, abused figure by some, and a cold-blooded social climber by others. But Richard, despite not facing criminal charges for the murder, was utterly ruined. His business partners deserted him, his lines of credit were pulled, and his name became synonymous with scandal. He was ostracized from the very high society circles he and his mother had prized above all else. He won the fortune but lost the kingdom. Clara took a plea deal, confessing to second-degree murder. Her defense team argued that she had acted under extreme emotional disturbance, a victim of years of psychological abuse. Her heartfelt testimony, combined with the evidence of Eleanor's manipulative behavior and Richard's callous indifference, swayed the judge. She was sentenced to 15 years in a state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole in 10. The final scene of the Beaumont saga took place in a sterile, state-appointed visitation room a year after the sentencing. Clara, now stripped of her designer clothes and jewelry, wearing a plain prison uniform, sat across a plastic table from her son, Leo. He was being raised by a maternal aunt, far away from the wreckage of his parents' lives. Their conversation was stilted, awkward. The easy affection they once shared now fractured by time and trauma. As Leo left with his aunt, Clara caught her reflection in the thick plexiglass divider. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Her face was thinner. Her eyes held a permanent sadness, and the vibrant life that Liam had briefly reawakened in her was gone. She had broken free from her gilded cage, but she had only ended up in a concrete one. She had silenced her tormentor, but the echoes of that final, violent act would reverberate for the rest of her life. The great tragedy of Clara Beaumont was not just that she had committed murder, but that in her desperate bid for freedom, she had destroyed the one thing she had been trying to protect, the future of her son, and any chance of a life for herself. The crimson threads of the Beaumont family had finally unraveled, leaving nothing behind but ruin, regret, and the haunting silence of a house that had consumed them all. A shocking and tragic end to a family that, from the outside, appeared to have it all. The Beaumont case serves as a stark warning about the secrets we keep and the quiet desperation that can fester behind even the most opulent doors. Justice was served, but at a cost that destroyed everyone involved. Thank you for joining us on Crimson Threads. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing our channel. We'll be back next week to unravel another case. Until then, be safe. And remember that the most complex stories are often the ones closest to home.